Hey everyone, this is Listen Marxist! Exclamation point by Marie Bookchin. It's from 1969. The table of contents says there's a prologue. The next section is historical limits of Marxism. The next section is myth of the proletariat. The next section is myth of the party. The next section is the two traditions, and an appendix, a note on affinity groups. And then it says remarks and footnotes. So, prologue. All the old crap of the 30s is coming back again. The shit about the class line, the quote class line, the quote role of the working class, the quote trained cadres, the quote vanguard party, the proletarian dictatorship. It's all back again in a more vulgarized form than ever. The Progressive Labor Party is not the only example, it is merely the worst. I'm reading this as part of a reading group, so I'm going to be looking stuff up, so I'm going to share this with the reading group. So Wikipedia says, the Progressive Labor Party is an anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninist communist party in the United States. It was established in January 1962 as the Progressive Labor Movement following a split in the Communist Party USA, adopting its new name at a convention held in the spring of 1965. It was involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement of the 1960s and early 1970s through its Worker-Student Alliance faction of the Students for a Democratic Society. The Progressive Labor Party publishes a fortnightly newspaper, Challenge. This is on the Wikipedia. It says its ideology is communism, Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, anti-revisionism. The Progressive Labor Party is not the only example. It is merely the worst. One smells the same shit in various offshoots of SDS and in the Marxist and Socialist clubs on campuses, not to speak of the Trotskyist groups, the International Socialist clubs, and Youth Against War and Fascism. I believe that's supposed to be independent socialist clubs, which is not a good sign that he's already getting that wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I don't know. It looks like it's on Wikipedia. If you type in International Socialist United States, it does give you a link to Hal Draper's club. I mean, so yeah. Been third camp, International Socialist, the third camp Trotskyist group. Youth Against War and Fascism is Youth Against War and Fascism appears to be a section of the youth section of the Workers' World Party. A youth organization first known as the Anti-Fascist Youth Committee and later as the Youth Against War and Fascism was created in April 1962. The Workers' World Party began publishing Workers' World in 1959. The newspaper has been a weekly since 1974. Workers' World Party is a Marxist-Leninist communist party founded in 1959 by Sam Marcy. Workers' World Party members are sometimes called Marcyites. Sam Marcy and his followers split from the Socialist Workers' Party, which is the American Trotskyist Party, in 1958 over a series of long-standing differences, among them their support for Henry A. Wallace's Progressive Party in 1948, their view of People's Republic of China as a worker state, and their defense of the 1956 Soviet intervention in Hungary, some of which the SWP opposed. Yeah. So, back to the text. In the 30s, at least, it was understandable. The United States was paralyzed by a chronic economic crisis, the deepest and longest in its history. The only living forces that seemed to be battering at the walls of capitalism were the great organizing drives of the CIO, their dramatic sit-down strikes, their radical militancy, and their bloody clashes with the police. The political atmosphere throughout the entire world was charged by the electricity of the Spanish Civil War, the last of the classical workers' revolutions, when every radical sect in the American left could identify with its own militia column in Madrid and Barcelona. That was 30 years ago. It was a time when anyone who cried out, quote, "make love, not war," end quote, would have been regarded as a freak. That cry then was, quote, "make jobs, not war," end quote. The cry of an age burdened by scarcity, when the achievement of socialism entailed, quote, "sacrifices," and a, quote, "transition period." Transition period is a important concept in Marx. That's the transition period being the dictatorship of the proletariat. But in the Trotskyist movement, the concept of transition period came to entail an entire society, right? A quote, "transitional society to an economy of material abundance." To an 18-year-old kid in 1937, the very concept of cybernation would have seemed like the wildest science fiction, a fantasy compared to visions of space travel. The 18-year-old kid has now reached 50 years of age, and his roots are planted in an era so remote as to differ qualitatively from the realities of the present period in the United States. Capitalism itself has changed since then, taking on increasingly statified forms that could be anticipated only dimly 30 years ago. And now we are being asked to go back to the, quote, "class line," end quote, the, quote, "strategies," the, quote, "cadres," and the organizational forms of that distant period, in most blatant disregard of the new issues and possibilities that have emerged. When the hell are we finally going to create a movement that looks to the future instead of to the past? When will we begin to learn from what is being born instead of what is dying? Marx, to his lasting credit, tried to do that in his own day. Marx tried to evoke a futuristic spirit in the revolutionary movement of the 1840s and 1850s. I like that, futuristic spirit. Quote, "the tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living," end quote, Marx wrote in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Quote, "and just when they seem to be engaged in revolutionizing themselves and things, in creating something entirely new, precisely in epochs of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure out the spirits of the past to service and borrow from them names, battle slogans, and costumes in order to present the new idea, the new scene of world history, in this time-honored disguise and borrowed language. Thus Luther donned the mask of the Apostle Paul. The revolution of 1789 to 1814 draped itself alternatively as the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, and the revolution of 1848 knew nothing better than to parody in its turn 1789 and the tradition of 1789 to 1795. ... The social revolution of the 19th century cannot draw its poetry from the past, but only from the future. It cannot begin with itself before it has stripped off all the superstition in regard to the past. ... In order to arrive at its content, the revolution of the 19th century must let the dead bury their dead. There the phrase went beyond the content. Here the content goes beyond the phrase," end quote, Marx. And you can kind of think of this in terms of one of the things that made me think of, at least, was that one of the leading left papers in the United States is the magazine Jacobin, referring to the most radical party of a bourgeois revolution. Is the problem any different today as we approach the 21st century? Once again, the dead are walking in our midst, ironically draped in the name of Marx, the man who tried to bury the dead of the 19th century. So the revolution of our own day can do nothing better than parody in turn the October Revolution of 1917 and the Civil War of 1918 to 1920 with its, quote, "class line," its Bolshevik party, its, quote, "proletarian dictatorship," end quote, its puritanical morality, and even its slogan, quote, "Soviet power," end quote. The complete all-sided revolution of our own day that can finally resolve the historic, quote, social question, end quote, born of scarcity, domination, and hierarchy, follows the tradition of the partial, the incomplete, the one-sided revolutions of the past, which merely changed the form of the, quote, social question, end quote, replacing one system of domination and hierarchy by another. At a time when bourgeois society itself is in the process of disintegrating all the social classes that once gave it stability, we hear the hollow demands for a class, quote, class line, end quote. At a time when all the political institutions of hierarchical society are entering a period of profound decay, we hear the hollow demands for a, quote, political party and a, quote, workers' state, end quote. At a time when hierarchy as such is being brought into question, we hear the hollow demands for, quote, cadres, quote, vanguards, and, quote, leaders. At a time when centralization and the state, had been brought to the most explosive point of historical negativity, we hear the hollow demands for a, quote, centralized movement and a, quote, proletarian dictatorship. This pursuit of security in the past, this attempt to find a haven in a fixed dogma and an organizational hierarchy as substitutes for creative thought and praxis, is bitter evidence of how little many revolutionaries are capable of, quote, revolutionizing themselves and things, end quote, much less of revolutionizing society as a whole. The deep-rooted conservatism of the Progressive Labor Party, quote, revolutionaries, is almost painfully evident. The authoritarian leader and hierarchy replaced the patriarch and the school bureaucracy. The discipline of the movement replaces the discipline of bourgeois society. The movement with capital M. The authoritarian code of political obedience replaces the state. The credo of, quote, proletarian morality, end quote, replaces the mores of puritanism and the work ethic. The old substance of exploitative society reappears in new forms draped in a red flag, decorated by portraits of Mao or Castro or Che, and adorned with the little, quote, red book, end quote, and other sacred litanies. Footnote. These lines were written when the Progressive Labor Party exercised a great deal of influence in SDS. Although the Progressive Labor Party has now lost most of its influence in the student movement, the organization still provides a good example of the mentality and values prevalent in the old left. The above characterization is equally valid for most Marxist-Leninist groups, hence this passage and other references to the Progressive Labor Party have not been substantially altered. The majority of people who remain in the Progressive Labor Party today deserve it. If they can live with a movement that cynically dubs its own slogans into the photographs of GRUM pickets, if they can read a magazine that asks whether Marcuse is a, quote, cop-out or, quote, cop, end quote, if they can accept a, quote, discipline, end quote, that reduces them to poker-faced programmed automata, if they can use the most disgusting techniques borrowed from the cesspool of bourgeois business operations and parliamentarianism, to manipulate other organizations, if they can parasitize virtually every action and situation merely to promote the growth of their party, even if this means defeat for the action itself, then they are beneath contempt. DRUM is the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, part of the Detroit-based League of Revolutionary Black Workers. For these people to call themselves Reds and describe attacks upon them as red baiting is a form of McCarthyism in reverse. To rephrase Trotsky's juicy description of Stalinism, they are the syphilis of the radical youth movement today. And for syphilis there is only one treatment, an antibiotic, not an argument. Our concern here is with those honest revolutionaries who have turned to Marxism, Leninism, or Trotskyism because they earnestly seek a coherent social outlook and an effective strategy of revolution. They are concerned with those who are awed by the theoretical repertory of Marxist ideology and are disposed to flirt with it in the absence of more systematic alternatives. To these people we address ourselves as brothers and sisters and ask for a serious discussion and a comprehensive reevaluation. We believe that Marxism has ceased to be applicable to our time, not because it is too visionary or revolutionary, but because it is not visionary or revolutionary enough. We believe it was born out of an era of scarcity and presented a brilliant critique of that era, specifically of industrial capitalism, and that a new era is in birth, which Marxism does not adequately encompass, and whose outlines it only partially and one-sidedly anticipated. We argue that the problem is not to, quote, abandon, end quote, Marxism, or to, quote, annul, end quote, Marxism, but to transcend Marxism dialectically, just as Marx transcended Hegelian philosophy, Ricardian economics, Blancist tactics and modes of organization. We shall argue that in a more advanced stage of capitalism than Marx dealt with a century ago, and in a more advanced stage of technological development than Marx could have clearly anticipated, a new critique is necessary, which in turn yields new modes of struggle, of organization, of propaganda, and of lifestyle. Call these new modes whatever you will, even, quote, Marxism, end quote, if you wish. We have chosen to call this new approach post-scarcity anarchism for a number of compelling reasons, which will become evident in the pages that follow. Excuse me. The historical limits of Marxism, new section. The idea that a man whose great theoretical contributions were made between 1840 and 1880 could, quote, foresee, end quote, the entire dialectic of capitalism is, on the face of it, utterly preposterous. If we can still learn much from Marx's insights, we can learn even more from the unavoidable errors of a man who was limited by an era of material scarcity and a technology that barely involved the use of electric power. Just as a side note, these are the kind of arguments that, not the same, I mean, with the same ambition, but these are very similar arguments to the arguments of, Marxism, Leninism, right? That Marx had brilliant insights for, the 19th century, but now that we live in the age of imperialism and wars and revolution, that Marx's insights are no longer relevant. Whereas the critique of what Bookchin is saying here, people would respond to it by saying that, like, that Capital, for instance, is not an empirical piece of historical research, but rather a conceptual reconstruction of the necessary organic structures of capitalism as such, right, at its ideal average. Yeah. So, continue. We can learn how different our own era is from all past history. How qualitatively new are the potentialities that confront us, how unique are the issues, analyses, and praxis that stand before us if we are to make a revolution and not another historical abortion. The problem is not that Marxism is a, quote, method, end quote, and must be reapplied to, quote, new situations, or that, quote, neo-Marxism, end quote, has to be developed to overcome the limitations of, quote, classical Marxism, end quote. The attempt to rescue the Marxian pedigree by emphasizing the method over the system or by adding, quote, neo to a sacred word is sheer mystification if all the practical conclusions of the system flatly contradict these efforts. Footnote. Marxism is above all a theory of praxis, or to place this relationship in its correct perspective, a praxis of theory. This is the very meaning of Marx's transformation of dialectics, which took it from the subjective dimension to which the young Hegelians still tried to confine Hegel's outlook, in the objective from philosophical critique into social action. If theory and praxis become divorced, Marxism is not killed, it commits suicide. This is the most admirable and noble feature. The attempt of the Cretans who follow in Marx's way to keep the system alive with a patchwork of emendations, exegesis, and half-assed, quote, scholarship, end quote, a la Maurice Daub and George Novak, are degrading insults to Marx's name and a disgusting pollution of everything Marx stood for. End footnote. This is precisely the state of affairs in in Marxian exegesis today. Marxists lean on the fact that the system provides a brilliant interpretation of the past while willfully ignoring its utterly misleading features in dealing with the present and future. They cite the coherence that historical materialism and the class analysis gives to the interpretation of history. The economic insights of capital provides into the development of industrial capitalism and the brilliance of Marx's analysis of earlier revolutions and the tactical conclusions Marx established, without once recognizing that qualitatively new problems have arisen which never existed in his day. It is conceivable that the historical problems and methods of class analysis, based entirely on unavoidable scarcity, can be transplanted into a new era of proletarian abundance. Is it conceivable that an economic analysis focused primarily on, quote, on a, quote, freely competitive, end quote, system of industrial capitalism can be transferred to a managed system of capitalism where state and monopolies combine to manipulate economic life? Is it conceivable that a strategic and tactical repertory formulated in a period when coal and steel constituted the basis of industrial technology can be transferred to an age based on radically new sources of energy, on electronics, on cybernation? What the hell is cybernation? Is it like cybernetics? I don't know. I'm not seeing anything when I Google cybernation. As a result of this transfer, a theoretical corpus which was liberated a century ago is turned into a straitjacket today. We are asked to focus on the working class as the, quote, agent, end quote, of revolutionary change at a time when capitalism visibly antagonizes and produces revolutionaries among virtually all strata of society, particularly the young. We are asked to guide our tactical methods by the vision of a, quote, chronic economic crisis, end quote, despite the fact that no such crisis has been in the offing for 30 years. There's a footnote here. In fact, Marxists do very little talking about the, quote, chronic economic crisis of capitalism, end quote, these days, despite the fact that this concept forms the focal point of Marx's economic theories. What was I going to say? I'm going to say that this is written right on the doorstep before a very major economic crisis in the 1970s. And it's kind of in line with a lot of like Marcusian think that like the proletariat is kind of like dead, and like, you know, then the real like revolutionary forces are people who, you know, like racial minorities, young people, students, the global South, just the outsiders or whatever, and that the working class is spent as a revolutionary force. Right on the doorstep of the biggest, what I believe at that time, maybe it's been surpassed, I'm not sure, but at least at that time was the biggest general strike in history in May 68. I believe that was the biggest general strike in history. It was May 1968 in Paris, with massive working class participation. This is from, it says this is from 1969, which is this is something, this kind of like idea of the working class being spent is something that seems like, never mind. Is that like a key part of like the Stalinism that is emerging in the student movement in retrospect is not like working, like is not like, to my understanding at least, maybe I'm fucking wrong about this, but it's not like steeped in like class struggle or steeped in like working class like radicalism, class struggle, but in like nationalist kind of conceptions of class struggle, right? So like the third world, which is now, you know, called like the global South, is the revolutionary force that is going to, you know, overturn the system of northern empires. So I'm a little caught, like they did definitely use these languages like dictatorship, proletarian dictatorship and class, and use some of the language of Marxism, but I think a lot of them held to a lot of the kind of view that was prominent in, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, so I'm kind of talking about my ass a little bit. One of the prominent views within Maoism that there was like, you know, a hierarchy of like contradictions or whatever that need to be fought out and defeated, fought out and won by the with progressive outcomes. And the main contradiction, the main conflict, was between the imperialist world and the non-imperialist world, right? So anti-imperialism, anti-Westernism became like the primary political ambition. And you kind of see this today still in like radical left, at least in my experience with like radical left like campus culture. It's very much this kind of like third worldist, like the main group that's operating on the campus that I go to is quote anti-imperialist action, which is it's not anti-capitalist action, it's not anti-fascist action, it's anti-imperialist action, and what it believes its primary thing to do is just to cheer on all the opponents of the United States without any kind of meaningful consideration of the contents of those rebellions against U.S. empire, and making the very fundamental 101 mistake of viewing the self-determination of a state with the self-determination of actual existing human beings, right? Not that the examples are one-to-one or whatever, but if you think of like the self-determination of Texas would pretty clearly not entail the self-determination of the people of Texas, particularly women. Basically, my thought to myself, basically at this point, was just like, it seems like, it seems to a certain extent that Bookchin is grasping some of like the gestalt of these movements, these dynamics within the student left, but not really kind of like maybe being a little sloppy on the particulars. Which obviously, you know, it's 2024. We have a lot more retrospect on this than he does writing in the thicket of it in 1969. Anyway, we are asked to accept a quote proletarian dictatorship, a long, quote, transition period whose function is not merely the suppression of counter-revolutionaries, but above all the development of a technology of abundance, at a time when a technology of abundance is at hand. We are asked to orient our, quote, strategies and, quote, tactics around poverty and material immiseration at a time when revolutionary sentiment is being generated by the banality of life under conditions of material abundance. We are asked to establish political parties, centralized organizations, quote, revolutionary, end quote, hierarchies and elites, and a new state at a time when political institutions are structure decaying and when centralization, elitism, and the state are being brought into question on a scale that has never occurred before in the history of hierarchical society. We are asked, in short, to return to the past, to diminish instead of grow, to force the throbbing reality of our times, with its hopes and promises, into the deadening preconceptions of an outlived age. We are asked to operate with principles that have been transcended and not theoretically, but not only theoretically, but by the very development of society itself. History has not stood still since Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky died, nor has history followed the simplistic direction which was charted out by thinkers, however brilliant, whose minds were still rooted in the 19th century or in the opening years of the 20th. We have seen capitalism still perform many of the tasks, including the development of a technology of abundance, which were regarded as socialist. We have seen it, quote, nationalize, end quote, property, merging the economy with the state wherever necessary. We have seen the working class neutralized as the, quote, agent of revolutionary change, end quote, albeit still struggling with a bourgeois framework for more wages, short hours, and, quote, fringe, end quote, benefits. The class struggle in the classical sense has not disappeared. It has suffered a more deadening fate, by being co-opted into capitalism. The revolutionary struggle within the advanced capitalist countries has shifted to a historically new terrain. It has become a struggle between a generation of youth that has known no chronic economic crisis in the culture, values, and institutions of an older, conservative generation whose perspective on life has been shaped by scarcity, guilt, renunciation, the work ethic, and the pursuit of material security. Our enemies are not only the visibly entrenched bourgeoisie and state apparatus, but also an outlook which finds its support among liberal social democrats, the minions of a corrupt mass media, the quote revolutionary end quote parties of the past, and painful as it may be to some acolytes of Marxism, the worker dominated by the factory hierarchy, by the industrial routine, and by the work ethic. The point is that the divisions now cut across virtually all the traditional class lines, and they raise a spectrum of problems which none of the Marxists, leaning on analogies with scarcity societies, could foresee. The myth of the proletariat. Let us cast aside all the ideological debris of the past and cut to the theoretical roots of the problem. For our age, Marx's greatest... it's a new section. The myth of the proletariat. I don't know if I said new section or not. Let us cast aside all the ideological debris of the past and cut to the theoretical roots of the problem. For our age, Marx's greatest contribution to revolutionary thought is his dialectic of social development. Marx laid bare the great movement from primitive communism through private property to communism in its higher form, a communal society resting on a liberatory technology. In this movement, according to Marx, man passes from the domination of man by nature to the domination of man by man, and finally to the domination of nature by man, and from social domination as such. Footnote: for ecological reasons, we do not accept the notion of the, quote, domination of nature by man, end quote, in the simplistic sense that was passed on by Marx a century ago. For discussion of this problem, see, quote, ecology and revolutionary thought, end quote. End footnote. Within this larger dialectic, Marx examines the dialectic of capitalism itself, a social system which constitutes the last historical, quote, stage, end quote, in the domination of man by man. Here Marx makes not only profound contributions to contemporary revolutionary thought, particularly in his brilliant analysis of the commodity relationship, but also exhibits those limitations of time and place that play so confining a role in our own time. The most serious of these limitations emerges from Marx's attempt to explain the transition from capitalism to socialism, from a society to a classless society. It is vitally important to emphasize that this explanation was reasoned out almost entirely by analogy of the transition of feudalism to capitalism, that is, from one class society to another class society, from one system of property to another system of property. Accordingly, Marx points out that just as the bourgeoisie developed within feudalism as a result of the split between town and country, more precisely between crafts and agriculture, so the modern proletariat developed within capitalism as a result of the advance of industrial technology. Both classes, we are told, develop social interests of their own, indeed revolutionary social interests that throw them against the old society in which they respond. If the bourgeoisie gained control over economic life long before it overthrew feudal society, the proletariat in turn gains its own revolutionary power by the fact that it is, quote, disciplined, united, organized, end quote, by the factory system. Footnote: it is ironic that Marxists who talk about the, quote, economic power, end quote, of the proletariat are actually echoing the position of the anarcho-syndicalists, a position that Marx bitterly opposed. Marx was not concerned with the, quote, economic power, end quote, of the proletariat, but with the proletariat's political power, notably the fact that it would become the majority of the population. He was convinced that the industrial worker would be driven to revolution primarily by material destitution, which would follow from the tendency of capitalist accumulation. That, organized by the factory system and disciplined by industrial routine, they would be able to constitute trade unions and, above all, political parties, which in some countries would be obliged to use insurrectionary methods, and in others, England, the United States, and in later years Engels added France, might well come to power in elections and legislate socialism into existence. Characteristically, many Marxists have been as dishonest with their Marx and Engels as the Progressive Labor Party has been with the readers of Challenge. leaving important observations untranslated or grossly distorting Marx's meaning. End footnote. In both cases, the development of the productive forces becomes incompatible with the traditional system of social relations. Quote, the integument is burst asunder, end quote. The old society is replaced by the new. The critical question we face is this: can we explain the transition from a class society to a class society by means of the same dialectic that accounts for the transition of one class to another? This is not a textbook problem that involves the juggling of logical abstractions, but a very real and concrete issue for our time. There are profound differences between the development of the bourgeoisie under feudalism and the development of the proletariat under capitalism, which Marx either failed to anticipate or never faced clearly. The bourgeoisie controlled economic life long before it took state power. The bourgeoisie had become the dominant class materially, culturally, and ideologically before it asserted its dominance politically. The proletariat does not control economic life. Despite its indispensable role in the industrial process, the industrial working class is not even a majority of the population, and the industrial working class's strategic economic position is being eroded by cybernation and other technological advances. Footnote. This is a good place as any to dispose of the notion that anyone is a, quote, proletariat, end quote, who has nothing to sell but his labor power. It is true that Marx defined the proletariat in these terms, but he also worked out a historical dialectic in the development of the proletariat. The proletariat developed out of a propertyless exploited class, reaching its most advanced form in the industrial proletariat, which corresponded to the most advanced form of capital. In the latter years of his life, Marx came to despise the Parisian workers, who were engaged preponderantly in the production of luxury goods, citing, quote, our German workers, end quote, the most robot-like in Europe as the, quote, model, end quote, proletariat of the world. Hence, it requires an act of high consciousness for the proletariat to use its power to achieve a social revolution. Until now, the achievement of this consciousness has been blocked by the fact that the factory milieu is one of the most well-entrenched arenas of the work ethic, of hierarchical systems of management, of obedience to leaders, and in recent times of production committed to superfluous commodities and armaments. The factory serves not only to, quote, discipline, quote, unite, and, quote, organize the workers, but also to do so in a thoroughly bourgeois fashion. In the factory, capitalistic production not only renews the social relations of capitalism with each working day, as Marx observed, it also renews the psyche, values, and ideology of capitalism. Marx sensed this fact sufficiently to look for reasons more compelling than the mere fact of exploitation or conflicts over wages and hours to propel the proletariat into revolutionary action. In his general theory of capitalist accumulation, he tried to delineate the harsh objective laws that forced the proletariat to assume a revolutionary role. Accordingly, Marx developed his famous theory of immiseration. Competition between capitalists compels them to undercut each other's prices, which in turn leads to a continual reduction of wages and absolute impoverishment of the workers. This interpretation of Marx is highly disputed. The proletariat is compelled to revolt because with the process of competition and the centralization of capital, there, quote, grows the mass of misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, end quote. Footnote. The attempt to describe Marx's immiseration theory in international terms instead of national, as Marx did, is sheer subterfuge. In the first place, this theoretical legerdemain simply tries to sidestep the question of why immiseration has not occurred within the industrial strongholds of capitalism, the only areas which form a technologically adequate point of departure for a classless society. If we are to pin our hopes on the colonial world as the, quote, proletariat, end quote, this position conceals a very real danger: genocide. America and a recent ally have also the technical means to bomb the underdeveloped world into submission. A threat lurks on the historical horizon: the development of the United States into a truly fascist imperium of the Nazi type. It is sheer rubbish to say that this country is a, quote, paper tiger, end quote. Is a thermonuclear tiger, and the American ruling class, lacking any cultural restraint, is capable of being more vicious than the German. End footnote. But capitalism has not stood still since Marx's day. Writing in the middle years of the 19th century, Marx could not be expected to grasp the full consequences of his insights into the centralization of capital and the development of technology, he could not be expected to foresee that capitalism would develop not only from mercantilism into the dominant industrial form of his day, from state-aided trading monopolies into highly competitive industrial units, but further that with the centralization of capital, capitalism returns to its mercantilist origins on a higher level of development and reassumes the state-aided monopolistic form. The economy tends to merge with the state and capitalism, begins to, quote, plan, end quote, its development instead of leaving it exclusively to the interplay of competition and market forces. To be sure, the system does not abolish the traditional class struggle, but manages to contain the traditional class struggle, using its immense technological resources to assimilate the most strategic sections of the working class. Thus, the full thrust of the immiseration theory is blunted, and in the United States, the traditional class struggle fails to develop into the class war. It remains entirely within bourgeois dimensions. Marxism, in fact, becomes ideology, is assimilated by the most advanced forms of the state capitalist movement, notably Russia. By an incredible irony of history, Marxian, quote, socialism, end quote, turns out to be in large part the very state capitalism that Marx failed to anticipate in the dialectic of capitalism. Footnote. Lenin sensed this and described, quote, socialism, end quote, as quote, nothing but state capitalist monopoly made to benefit the whole people, end quote. This is an extraordinary statement if one thinks out its implications and a mouthful of contradictions. The proletariat, end footnote. The proletariat, instead of developing into a revolutionary class within the womb of capitalism, turns out to be an organ within the body of bourgeois society. The question we must ask at this late date in history is whether a social revolution that seeks to achieve a classless society can emerge from a conflict between traditional classes in a class society, or whether such a social revolution can only emerge from the decomposition of the traditional classes. Indeed, from the emergence of an entirely new, quote, class, end quote, whose very essence is that it is a non-class, a growing stratum of revolutionaries. In trying to answer this question, we can learn more by returning to the broader dialectic which Marx developed for human society as a whole than from the model he borrowed from the passage of feudal into capitalist society. Just as primitive kinship clans began to differentiate into classes, so in our day there is a tendency for classes to decompose into entirely new subcultures which bear a resemblance to non-capitalist forms of relationships. These are not strictly economic groups anymore. In fact, they reflect the tendency of the social development to transcend the economic categories of scarcity society. They constitute, in effect, a crude, ambiguous cultural performation of the movement of scarcity into post-scarcity society. The process of class decomposition must be understood in all its dimensions. The word, quote, process, end quote, must be emphasized here. The traditional classes do not disappear, nor for that matter does the class struggle. Only a social revolution could remove the prevailing class structure and the conflicts it engenders. The point is that the traditional class struggle ceases to have revolutionary implications. It reveals itself as the physiology of the prevailing society, not as the labor pains of birth. In fact, the traditional class struggle stabilizes capitalist society by, quote, correcting, end quote, capitalist society's abuses in wages, hours, inflation, employment, etc. The unions in capitalist society constitute themselves into a counter, quote, monopoly, end quote, to the industrial monopolies and are incorporated into the neo-mercantile statified economy as an estate. Within this estate there are lesser or greater conflicts, but taken as a whole, the union strengthens the system and serves to perpetuate it. To reinforce this class structure by babbling about the, quote, role of the working class, end quote, to reinforce the traditional class struggle by imputing a, quote, revolutionary, end quote, content to it, to infect the new revolutionary movement of our time with, quote, workerist, end quote, quote, workerist, end quote, is reactionary to the core. Reactionary to the core. How often do the Marxian doctrinaires have to be reminded that the history of the class struggle is the history of a disease, of the wounds opened by the famous, quote, social question, end quote, of man's one-sided development in trying to gain control over nature by dominating his fellow man? If the byproduct of this disease has been technological advance, the main products have been repression, a horrible shedding of human blood, and a terrifying distortion of the human psyche. As the disease approaches its end, as the wound begins to heal in their deepest recesses, the process now unfolds towards wholeness. The revolutionary implication of the traditional class struggle lose their meaning as theoretical constructs and as a social reality. The process of decomposition embraces not only the traditional class structure, but also the patriarchal family, authoritarian modes of upbringing, the influence of religion, the institution of the state, and the mores built around toil, renunciation, guilt, and repressed sexuality. The process of disintegration, in short, now becomes generalized and cuts across virtually all the traditional classes, values, and institutions. The process of disintegration, in short, now becomes generalized and cuts across virtually all the traditional classes, values, and institutions. The process of disintegration creates entirely new issues, modes of struggle, and forms of organization, and calls for an entirely new approach to theory and praxis. It creates entirely new issues, modes of struggle, and forms of organization, and calls for an entirely new approach to theory and praxis. What does this mean concretely? Let us contrast two approaches, the Marxian and the revolutionary. The Marxian doctrinaire would have us approach the worker, or better, quote, enter, end quote, the factory, and proselytize the worker in, quote, preference, end quote, to anyone else. The purpose, to make the worker, quote, class conscious, end quote. To cite the most Neanderthal examples from the old left, one cuts one's hair, grooms oneself in conventional sports clothing, abandons pot for cigarettes and beer, dances conventionally, affects, quote, rough, end quote, mannerisms, and develops a humorless, deadpan, and pompous mien. Footnote. On this score, the old left projects its own Neanderthal image on the American worker. Actually, this image more closely approximates the character of the Union bureaucrat or the Stalinist commissar. End footnote. Sorry, I have to copy that down. That's a good one. Sorry, I apologize for you having to listen to dead air, but that's a good one. One becomes, in short, what the worker is at his most caricatured worst. Not a, quote, petty bourgeois degenerate, end quote, to be sure, but a bourgeois degenerate. One becomes an imitation of the worker, insofar as the worker is an imitation of his masters. Beneath this metamorphosis of the student into the, quote, worker, end quote, lies a vicious cynicism. One tries to use the discipline inculcated by the factory milieu to discipline the worker to the party milieu. One tries to use the worker's respect for the industrial hierarchy to wed the worker to the party hierarchy. This disgusting process, which is successful which if successful could lead only to the substitution of one hierarchy for another, is achieved by pretending to be concerned with the workers' economic day-to-day demands. Even Marxian theory is degraded to accord with the debased image of the worker. See almost any copy of Challenge, the National Enquirer of the left. Yo, Bookchin's got jokes. Nothing bores the worker more than this kind of literature. In the end, the worker is shrewd enough to know that he will get better results in the day-to-day class struggle through his union bureaucracy than through a Marxian party bureaucracy. The 40s revealed this so dramatically that within a year or two, with hardly any protest from the rank and file, unions succeeded in kicking out by the thousands, quote, Marxians, end quote, who had done spade work in the labor movement for more than a decade, even to rise to the top leadership of the old CIO internationals. The worker becomes a revolutionary not by becoming more of a worker, but by undoing his, quote, workerness, end quote. That's fucking genius. The worker becomes a revolutionary not by becoming more of a worker, but by undoing his, quote, workerness, end quote. And in this he is not alone. The same applies to the farmer, the student, the clerk, the soldier, the bureaucrat, the professional, and the Marxist. The worker is no less a, quote, bourgeois, end quote, than the farmer, student, clerk, soldier, bureaucrat, professional, and Marxist. The worker's, quote, workerness, end quote, is the disease the worker is suffering from, the social affliction telescoped to individual dimensions. Lenin understood this and what is to be done, but he smuggled in the old hierarchy under a red flag and some revolutionary verbiage. The worker begins to become a revolutionary when he undoes his, quote, workerness, end quote. When the worker comes to detest his class status here and now, and he begins to shed exactly those features which the Marxists most prize in him. His work ethic, his character structure, derived from industrial discipline, his respect for hierarchy, his obedience to leaders, his consumerism, his vestiges of Puritanism. In this sense, the worker becomes a revolutionary to the degree that he sheds his class status and achieves an unclass consciousness. He degenerates magnificently. What he is shedding are precisely those class shackles that bind him to all systems of domination. He abandons those class interests that enslave him to consumerism, suburbia, and a bookkeeping conception of life. The most promising development in the factories today is the emergence of young workers who smoke pot, fuck off on their jobs, drift into and out of factories, grow long or longish hair, demand more leisure time rather than more pay, steal, harass all authority figures, go on wildcats, and turn on their fellow workers. Even more promising is the emergence of this human type. I don't know if it means turn on their fellow workers. I guess it means not like turn their back, but like turn them on. Get them going. Even more promising is the emergence of this human type in trade schools and high schools, the reservoir of the industrial working class to come. To the degree that workers, vocational students, and high school students link their lifestyles to various aspects of the anarchic youth culture, to that degree will the proletariat be transformed from a force for the conservation of the established order into a force for revolution. A qualitatively new situation emerges when man is faced with a transformation from a repressive class society based on material scarcity into a liberatory classless society based on material abundance. From the decomposing traditional class structure, a new human type is created in ever-increasing numbers, the revolutionary. The revolutionary begins to challenge not only the economic and political premises of hierarchical society, but hierarchy as such. He not only raises the need for social revolution, but also tries to live in a revolutionary manner to the degree that this is possible in the existing society. Footnote. This revolutionary lifestyle may develop in the factories as well as on the streets and schools, as well as in crash pads in the suburbs, as well as on the Bay Area East Side axis. Its essence is defiance and a personal, quote, propaganda of the deed, end quote, that erodes all the mores, institutions, and shibboleths of domination. As society begins to approach the threshold of the revolutionary period, the factories, schools, and neighborhoods become the actual arena of revolutionary, quote, play. A, quote, play that has a very serious core. Strikes become a chronic condition and are called for their own sake to break the veneer of routine, to defy the society on an almost hourly basis, to shatter the mood of bourgeois morality. This new mood of the workers, students, and neighborhood people is a vital precursor to the actual moment of revolutionary transformation. Its most conscious expression is the demand for, quote, self-management. The worker refuses to be a, quote, managed being, a class being. This process was most evident in Spain on the eve of the 1936 revolution, when workers in almost every city and town called strikes, quote, for the hell of it, end quote, to express their independence, their sense of awakening, their break with the social order and with bourgeois conditions of life. It is also an essential feature of the 1968 general strike in France. End footnote. He not only attacks the forms created by the legacy of domination, but also improvises new forms of liberation which take their poetry from the future. This preparation for the future, this experimentation with liberatory post-scarcity forms of social relations may be illusory if the future involves a substitution of one class society by another class society. It is indispensable, however, if the future involves a classless society, but on the ruins of a class society. What then will be the, quote, agent, end quote, of revolutionary change? It will be literally the great majority of society, drawn from all the different traditional classes and fused into a common revolutionary force by the decomposition of the institutions, social forms, values, and lifestyles of the prevailing class structure. Typically, its most advanced elements are the youth, a generation that has known no chronic economic crisis and that is becoming less and less oriented toward the myth of material security, so widespread among the generation of the 30s. It is true that a social revolution cannot be achieved without the active or passive support of the workers. It is no less true that it cannot be achieved without the active or passive support of the farmers, technicians, and professionals. Above all, a social revolution cannot be achieved without the support of the youth, from which the ruling class recruits its armed forces. If the ruling system retains its armed might, the revolution is lost, no matter how many workers rally to its support. This has been vividly demonstrated not only by Spain in the 30s, but by Hungary in the 50s and Czechoslovakia in the 60s. The revolution of today, by its very nature, indeed, by its pursuit of wholeness, wins not only the soldier and the worker, but the generation from which soldiers, workers, technicians, farmers, scientists, professionals, and even bureaucrats have been recruited. Discarding the tactical handbooks of the past, the revolution of the future follows the path of least resistance, eating its way into the most susceptible areas of the population, irrespective of their, quote, class position, end quote. It is nourished by all the contradictions in bourgeois society, not simply by the contradictions of the 1860s and 1917. Hence it attacks all those who feel the burdens of exploitation. It attracts all those who feel the burdens of exploitation, poverty, racism, imperialism, and yes, those whose lives are frustrated by consumerism, suburbia, the mass media, the family, school, the supermarket, and the prevailing system of repressed sexuality. Here the form of the revolution becomes as total as its content classless, propertyless, hierarchyless, and wholly liberating. To barge into this revolutionary development with the worn recipes of Marxism, to babble about a, quote, class line, end quote, and the, quote, role of the working class, end quote, amounts to a subversion of the present and the future of the past. To elaborate this deadening ideology by babbling about cadres a, quote, vanguard party, quote, democratic centralism, and the, quote, proletarian dictatorship, end quote, is sheer counter-revolution? Is this matter of the, quote, organizational question, end quote, this vital contribution of Leninism to Marxism that we must now direct some attention? New section, the myth of the party. Social revolutions are not made by parties, groups, or cadres. They occur as a result of deep-seated historic forces and contradictions that activate large sections of the population. Sorry, 1 second. One second, sorry. I just realized I had to charge something important. Okay, so here we go. Social revolutions are not made by parties, groups, or cadres. They occur as a result of deep-seated historic forces and contradictions that activate large sections of the population. They occur not merely because the, quote, masses, end quote, find the existing society intolerable, as Trotsky argued, but also because of the tension between the actual and the possible, between what is and what could be. Abject misery alone does not produce revolutions. More often than not, it produces an aimless demoralization, or worse, a private personalized struggle to survive. The Russian Revolution of 1917 weighs on the brain of the living like a nightmare because it was largely the product of, quote, intolerable conditions, end quote, of a devastating imperialistic war. Whatever dreams it had were virtually destroyed by an even bloodier civil war, by famine and by treachery. What emerged from the revolution were the ruins not of an old society, but of whatever hopes existed to achieve a new one. The Russian Revolution failed miserably. It replaced Tsarism by state capitalism. Footnote. A fact which Trotsky never understood. Trotsky never followed through the consequences of his own concept of, quote, combined development, end quote, to its logical conclusion. He saw quite correctly that Tsarist Russia, the latecomer in the European bourgeois development, necessarily acquired the most advanced industrial and class forms instead of recapitulating the entire bourgeois development from its beginnings. He neglected to consider that Russia, torn by tremendous internal upheaval, might even run ahead of the capitalist development elsewhere in Europe. Hypnotized by the formula, quote, nationalized property equals socialism, end quote, Trotsky failed to recognize that monopoly capitalism itself tends to amalgamate with the state by its own inner dialectic. The Bolsheviks, having cleared away the traditional forms of bourgeois social organization, which still act as a rein on the state capitalist development in Europe and America, inadvertently prepared the ground for a, quote, pure, end quote, state capitalist development in which the state finally becomes the ruling class. Lacking support from a technologically advanced Europe, the Russian Revolution became an internal counter-revolution. Soviet Russia became a form of state capitalism that does, quote, benefit the whole that does not, quote, benefit the whole people, end quote. Lenin's analogy between, quote, socialism and state capitalism became a terrifying reality under Stalin. Despite its humanistic core, Marxism failed to comprehend how much its concept of, quote, socialism, end quote, approximates a later stage of capitalism itself, the return to mercantile forms on a higher industrial level. The failure to understand this development led to devastating theoretical confusion in the contemporary revolutionary movement, as witnessed the splits among the Trotskyists over this question. I don't think Marx's concept of socialism entails a return to mercantile forms on a higher industrial level. And it's also problematic to view Lenin or Leninism as as Marxism as such. I'm pretty sure Bookchin knows that But the Bolsheviks were the tragic victim, end footnote, the Bolsheviks were tragic victims of their own ideology and paid with their lives in great number during the purges of the 30s. To attempt to acquire any unique wisdom from this scarcity revolution is ridiculous. What we can learn from the revolution of the past is what all revolutions have in common, and the profound limitations compared with the enormous possibilities that are now open to us. The most striking feature of the past revolutions is that they began spontaneously. Whether one chooses to examine the opening phases of the French Revolution of 1789, the revolutions of 1848, the Paris Commune, the 1905 Revolution in Russia, the overthrow of the Tsar in 1917, the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, or the French General Strike of 1968, the opening stages are generally the same. A period of ferment explodes spontaneously into a mass surge. Whether the upsurge is successful or not depends on its resoluteness and on whether the troops go over to the people. The, quote, glorious party, end quote, when there is one, almost invariably lags behind the events. In February 1917, the Petrograd organization of the Bolsheviks opposed the calling of strikes precisely on the eve of the revolution, which was destined to overthrow the Tsar. Unfortunately, the workers ignored the Bolshevik, quote, directives and went on strike anyway. In the events which followed, no one was more surprised by the revolution than the, quote, revolutionary, end quote, parties, including the Bolsheviks, as Bolshevik leader Kagurov recalled, quote, absolutely no guiding initiative from the party were felt. ... The Petrograd Committee had been arrested, and the representative from the Central Committee, Comrade Shlepnikov, was unable to give any directives for the coming day, end quote. Alexander Shlepnikov was a trade union leader who eventually led the workers' opposition within the Bolshevik Party until the outlawing of factions in the 1921 10th Party Congress. And it just says that Benjamin Kayarov, who lived from 1876 to 1936, was a Russian Bolshevik revolutionary. Who was shot in 1936, by the way. Footnote. Quoted in Leon Trotsky, that quote from Kayarov was from Leon Trotsky, The History of the Russian Revolution. Perhaps this was fortunate. End footnote. Before the Petrograd Committee was arrested, its evaluation of the situation in its own role had been so dismal that had the workers followed its guidance, it is doubtful that the revolution would have occurred when it did. The same kind of story could be told of the upsurges that preceded 1917 and those which followed. To cite only the most recent, the student uprising and general strike in France during May-June 1968. There is a convenient tendency to forget that close to a dozen, quote, tightly centralized, end quote, Bolshevik organizations existed in Paris at this time. It is rarely mentioned that virtually every one of these, quote, vanguard, end quote, groups sustained the student uprising up to May 7th, when the street fighting broke out in earnest. The Trotskyist Jeunesse Communiste Révolutionnaire was a notable exception, and it merely coasted along, essentially following the initiative of the March 22nd movement. Wikipedia says the Revolutionary Communist Youth, which is what the Jeunesse Communiste Révolutionnaire was, is a former Trotskyist youth organization that existed from 1966 to 1968, some of whose activists come from the PCI and ancestor of the Communist League, then the Revolutionary Communist League, and the new anti-capitalist NPA. It sucks that French Wikipedia does not seem as good as German Wikipedia. Or rather, Perhaps it's the Google Translate is way better at translating German than French. Where am I? So that's what the Jeunesse Communiste Révolutionnaire was. Let's see what the March 22nd movement is. The movement of the 22nd of March, or the Mouvement du, I don't know how to say 22 in French, and Mars, or Mar. Movement of the 22nd of March was a French student movement in the University of Nanterre, founded on the 22nd of March 1968, which carried out a prolonged occupation of the university's administration building. Among its principal leaders was Daniel Cohn-Bendit. After occupying the building, the school dean called the police, and a public scuffle ensued that garnered the movement media and intellectual attention. This event was one of a series of clashes that led to the nationwide protests in May 1968 in France. The events of the 22nd of March became the subject of Robert Merle's 1970 novel Derrière la Vitre, published in USA in 1972 as Behind the Glass. Back to the text. Up to the 7th... Footnote. The March 22nd movement functioned as a catalytic agent in the events, not as a leadership. The March 22nd movement did not command. The March 22nd movement instigated, leaving free play to the events. This free play, which allowed the students to push ahead on the students' own momentum, was indispensable to the dialectic of the uprising, for without it, there would have been no barricades on May 10th, which in turn triggered off the general strike of the workers. End footnote. Up to May 7th, all the Maoist groups criticized the student uprising as peripheral and unimportant. The Trotskyist Federation des Etudiants Révolutionnaires regarded it as a, quote, adventuristic, end quote, and tried to get the students to leave the barricades on May 10th. The Communist Party, of course, played a completely treacherous role. Far from leading the popular movement, the Maoists and Trotskyists were its captives throughout. Ironically, most of these Bolshevik groups used manipulation techniques shamelessly in the Sorbonne student assembly in an effort to, quote, control, end quote, it, introducing a disruptive atmosphere that demoralized the entire body. Finally, to complete the irony, all of these Bolshevik groups were to babble about the need for, quote, centralized leadership, end quote, when the popular movement collapsed, a movement that occurred despite their, quote, directives, end quote, and often in opposition to their directives. If you're looking for something interesting to read, I would highly recommend checking out, or listen to on the channel, is to check out Maurice Brinton's, I can't remember what the title is called, but he has some like first-hand accounts of like what he saw in May 68, some like the first-hand like journalistic descriptions of what transpired in May 68. And provides kind of some of the snapshot of these student politics and how like there was consistently like vanguard parties trying to establish themselves as the leaders of the movement. And a lot, oftentimes looking very ridiculous and oftentimes being disruptive, as Bookchin is saying here. Back to the text. Revolutions and uprisings were the... Oh shit, I forgot to look something up actually. Fédération des étudiants révolutionnaires is translated as the Federation of Revolutionary Students, FER, was born from the refoundation during a congress in April 1968 of the Liaison Committee of Revolutionary Students, CLER, founded in 1961, shortly after the creation of the Anti-Fascist University Front, and which distributed the newspaper Revolt. It is a small Trotskyist group from the Lambertist branch, OCI, which joined the Internationalist Communist Organization, and which renamed itself Youth Alliance for Socialism to no longer address only students. Back to the text. Where am I? Okay. Revolutions and uprisings. Where am I? Revolutions and uprisings worthy of any note not only have an initial phase that is magnificently anarchic, but also tend spontaneously to create their own forms of revolutionary self-management. The Parisian sections of 1793 to 94 were the most remarkable forms of self-management to be created by any of the social revolutions in history. Footnote. See, quote, The Forms of Freedom, end quote, which I guess is a piece by Bookchin. End footnote. More familiar in form were the councils or, quote, Soviets, end quote, which the Petrograd workers established in 1905. Although less democratic than the sections, the councils were to appear in a number of later revolutions. Still another form of revolutionary self-management were the factory committees which the anarchists established in the Spanish Revolution of 1936. Finally, the sections reappeared as student assemblies and action committees in the May-June uprising and general strike in Paris in 1968. Footnote. With a sublime arrogance that is attributable partly to ignorance, a number of Marxist groups were to dub virtually all the above forms of self-management as, quote, Soviets, end quote. The attempt to bring all these different forms under a single rubric is not only misleading but willfully obscurantist. The actual Soviets were the least democratic of the revolutionary forms, and the Bolsheviks shrewdly used them to transfer the power to their own party. The Soviets were not based on face-to-face democracy like the Parisian sections or the student assemblies of 1968, nor were they based on economic self-management like the Spanish anarchist factory committees. The Soviets actually formed a workers' parliament, hierarchically organized, which drew its representation from factories and later from military units and peasant villages. I can't really speak in any detail on this, but I will say that the factory committees are an important part of the early stages of the Russian Revolution and progressively lost power and influence. The Soviets definitely viewed them as not as institutions of future self-rule, but as instruments. Where am I? Instruments of revolution, instruments of war, class war. Not as institutions with institutions of democratic self-management of society. End footnote. At this point, we must ask what role of the quote revolutionary end quote party plays in all these developments. In the beginning, as we have seen, it tends to have an inhibitory function, not a, quote, vanguard, end quote, role. Where it exercises influence, it tends to slow down the flow of events, not, quote, coordinate, end quote, the revolutionary forces. This is not accidental. The party is structured along hierarchical lines that reflect the very society it professes to oppose. Despite its theoretical pretensions, it is a bourgeois organism, a miniature state, with an apparatus and a cadre whose function it is to seize power, not dissolve power. Rooted in the pre-revolutionary period, it assimilates all the forms, techniques, and mentality of bureaucracy. Its membership is schooled in obedience and in the preconceptions of a rigid dogma and is taught to revere the leadership. The party's leadership, in turn, is schooled in habits born of command, authority, manipulation, and egomania. This situation is worsened when the party participates in parliamentary elections. In election campaigns, the vanguard party models itself completely on existing bourgeois forms and even acquires the paraphernalia of the electoral party. The situation assumes truly critical proportions when the party acquires large presses, costly headquarters, and a large inventory of centrally controlled periodicals, and develops a paid, quote, apparatus, end quote. In short, a bureaucracy with vested material interests. As the party expands, the distance between the leadership and the ranks invariably increases. Its leaders not only become, quote, personages, end quote, they lose contact with the living situation below. The local groups, which know their own immediate situation better than any remote leader, are obliged to subordinate their insights to directives from below. The leadership, lacking any direct knowledge of local problems, responds sluggishly and prudently. Although it stakes out a claim to the, quote, larger view, end quote, to greater, quote, theoretical competence, end quote, the competence of the leadership tends to diminish as one ascends the hierarchy of command. The more one approaches the level where the real decisions are made, the more conservative is the nature of the decision-making process. The more bureaucratic and extraneous are the factors which come into play. The more considerations of prestige and retrenchment supplant creativity, imagination, and a disinterested dedication to revolutionary goals. The party becomes less efficient from a revolutionary point of view, especially when events begin to move rapidly and take the unexpected turns, as they do in all revolutions. The party is inefficient in only one respect, in molding society in its own hierarchical image. If the revolution is successful, it recreates bureaucracy, centralization, in the state. It fosters the bureaucracy, centralization, in the state. It fosters the very social conditions which justify this kind of society. Hence, instead of, quote, withering away, end quote, the state controlled by the, quote, glorious party, end quote, preserves the very conditions which, quote, necessitate, end quote, the existence of a state and a party to, quote, guard it. On the other hand, this kind of party is extremely vulnerable in periods of repression. The bourgeoisie has only to grab its leadership to destroy virtually the entire movement. With its leaders in prison or in hiding, the party becomes paralyzed. The obedient membership has no one to obey and tends to flounder. Demoralization sets in rapidly. The party decomposes not only because of the repressive atmosphere, but also because of its poverty of inner resources. The foregoing account is not a series of hypothetical inferences, a composite sketch of all the mass Marxian parties of the past century. The Social Democrats, the Communists, and the Trotskyist Party of Ceylon, the only mass party of its kind. To claim that these parties failed to take their Marxian principles seriously merely conceals another question. Why did this failure happen in the first place? The fact is, these parties were co-opted into bourgeois society because they were structured along bourgeois lines. The germ of treachery existed in them from birth. The Bolshevik Party was spared this fate between 1904 and 1917 for only one reason. It was an illegal organization during most of the years leading up to the revolution. The party was continually being shattered and reconstituted, with the result that until it took power, it never really hardened into a fully centralized, bureaucratic, hierarchical machine. Moreover, it was riddled with factions. The intensely factional atmosphere persisted throughout 1917 into the Civil War. Nevertheless, the Bolshevik leadership was ordinarily extremely conservative, a trait that Lenin had to fight throughout 1917, first in his effort to reorient the Central Committee against the Provisional Government, the famous conflict over the, quote, April Theses, end quote, later in driving the Central Committee towards insurrection in October. In both cases, Lenin threatened to resign from the Central Committee and bring his views to the, quote, lower ranks of the party, end quote. In 1918, factional disputes over the issue of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty became so serious that the Bolsheviks nearly split into two warring communist parties. Oppositional Bolshevik groups like the Democratic Centralists and the Workers' Opposition waged bitter struggles within the party throughout 1919 and 1920, not to speak of oppositional movements that developed within the Red Army over Trotsky's propensity for centralization. Complete centralization of the Bolshevik Party, the achievement of, quote, Leninist unity, end quote, as it was to be called later, did not occur until 1921, when Lenin succeeded in persuading the 10th Party Congress to ban factions. By this time, most of the White Guards had been crushed, and the foreign interventionists had withdrawn their troops from Russia. It cannot be stressed too strongly that the Bolsheviks tended to centralize their party to the degree that they became isolated from the working class. The relationship has rarely been investigated in latter-day Leninist circles. Although Lenin was honest enough to admit it, the story of the Russian Revolution is not merely the story of the Bolshevik Party and its supporters. Beneath the veneer of official events described by Soviet historians, there was another, more basic development: the spontaneous movement of the workers and revolutionary peasants, which later clashed sharply with the bureaucratic policies of the Bolsheviks. With the overthrow of the Tsar in February 1917, workers in virtually all the factories of Russia spontaneously established factory committees, staking out an increasing claim on industrial operations. In June 1917, an all-Russian conference of factory committees was held in Petrograd, which called for the, quote, organization of thorough control by labor over production and distribution, end quote. The demands of this conference are rarely mentioned in Leninist accounts of the Russian Revolution, despite the fact that the conference aligned itself with the Bolsheviks. Trotsky, who described the factory committees as, quote, the most direct and indubitable representation of the proletariat in the whole country, end quote, deals with them peripherally in his massive 3-volume history of the revolution. Yet so important were these spontaneous organizations of self-management that Lenin, despairing of winning the Soviets in the summer of 1917, was prepared to jettison the slogan, quote, all power to the Soviets, end quote, for, quote, all power to the factory committees, end quote. This demand would have catapulted the Bolsheviks into a completely anarcho-syndicalist position, although it is doubtful they would have remained there very long. If you listen to there's a talk by Stephen A. Smith, who's like probably one of the most important scholars of international communism there is. He wrote the very short introduction to the Russian Revolution for Oxford. And if you ever get a chance to hear him say anything, it's very interesting. But in one of his, he has a talk on the social histories of Revolution channel that is defunct now, but has a lot of very good videos on it. Where he discusses this kind of he says that he believes that Lenin genuinely had like a very a kind of perhaps sincere utopian snap in mid-1917. But what the main priority of the Bolsheviks, their main view was that Russia was a backward country, and what this entailed was an increase in productivity to make it not backward country, and if labor discipline had to be harshly enforced, then so be it. Which basically is saying that they viewed what was needed in some respect as state capitalism, right? You don't industrialize a country without exploitation. You don't increase productivity. You don't create a self-managed form of social life by having a top-down accumulation process, right? Anyway, the state capitalist part is not what Stephen A. Smith says. That's what I'm saying. And that's kind of actually a lot of the early state capitalist people who criticize the USSR as state capitalist is basically what they say, right? Anyway, with the October Revolution, all the factory committees seized control of the plants, ousting the bourgeoisie and completely taking control of industry. In accepting the concept of workers' control, Lenin's famous decree of the November 14, 1917, merely acknowledged an accomplished fact. The Bolsheviks dared not oppose the workers at this early date, but they began to whittle down the power of the factory committees. I have an excellent book on this channel that you should check out. It's called The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control by Marty Sprinton of Solidarity fame. And basically anything that Marty Sprinton has to say about the Russian Revolution is very, very interesting. Whatever maybe some limitations might be of it, it's a reference point that needs to be, he's an important reference that needs to be taken seriously. But yeah, check that out. It's about like kind of like the dismantling of institutions of self-management in the early days of the October Revolution. It's like a chronology. Anyway, in January 1918, a scant 2 months after, quote, decreeing workers' control, Lenin began to advocate that the administration of the factories be placed under trade union control. The story that the Bolsheviks, quote, patiently, end quote, experimented with workers' control, only to find it, quote, inefficient and, quote, chaotic, is a myth. Their, quote, patience, end quote, did not last more than a few weeks. Not only did Lenin oppose direct workers' control within a matter of weeks after the decree of November 1914, even union control came to an end shortly after it had been established. By the summer of 1918, almost all of Russian industry had been placed under bourgeois forms of management. As Lenin put it, the, quote, revolutionary demands, precisely in the interest of socialism, that the masses unquestionably obey the single will of the leaders of the labor process, end quote. Thereafter, workers' control was denounced not only as, quote, inefficient, quote, chaotic, and, quote, impractical, but also as, quote, petty bourgeois. Footnote. Vladimir Lenin, The Immediate Tasks of the Soviet Government. In this harsh article, published in April 1918, Lenin had completely abandoned the libertarian perspective he had advanced the year before in State and Revolution. The main themes of the article are the needs for, quote, discipline, end quote, for authoritarian control over the factories, and for the institution of the tailor system, a system Lenin had denounced before the revolution as enslaving men to the machine. The article was written during a comparatively peaceful period of Bolshevik rule, some 2 months after the signing of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, and a month before the revolt of the Czech Legion and the Urals, the revolt that started the Civil War on a wide scale and opened the period of direct Allied intervention in Russia. Finally, the article was written nearly a year before the defeat of the German Revolution. It would be difficult to account for the, quote, immediate tasks, merely in terms of the Russian Civil War and the failure of the European Revolution. Wikipedia says the revolt of the Czechoslovak Legion comprised the armed action of the Czechoslovak Legion in the Russian Civil War and against Bolshevik authorities, beginning in May 1918 and persisting through the evacuation of the Legion from Siberia to Europe in 1920. The revolt occurring in Volga, Ural, and Siberia regions along the Trans-Siberian Railway was a reaction to a threat initiated by the Bolsheviks partly as a consequence of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. One major secondary consequence of victories by the Legion over the Bolsheviks was to catalyze anti-Bolshevik activity in Siberia, particularly the Committee of Members of the Constituent Assembly, and to provide a major boost for the anti-Bolshevik or white forces, likely protracting the Russian Civil War. Back to the text, end footnote. Here we go. The left communist Osinski bitterly attacked all of these spurious claims and warned the party, quote, socialism and socialist organization must be set up by the proletariat itself, or they will not be set up at all. Something else will be set up, state capitalism, end quote. In the, quote, interest of socialism, end quote, the Bolshevik Party elbowed the proletariat out of every domain it had conquered by its own efforts and initiative. The party did not coordinate the revolution or even lead it. It dominated it. First, workers' control and later union control were replaced by an elaborate hierarchy as monstrous as any structure that existed in pre-revolutionary times. As later years were to demonstrate, Osinski's prophecy became reality. The problem of, quote, who is to prevail, end quote, the Bolsheviks or the Russian, quote, masses, end quote, was by no means limited to the factories. The issue reappeared in the countryside as well as the cities, a sweeping peasant war that buoyed up the movement of the workers. Contrary to official Leninist accounts, the agrarian upsurge was by no means limited to a redistribution of the land into private plots. In the Ukraine, peasants influenced the anarchist militias of Nestor Makhno and guided by the communist maxim, quote, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, end quote, established a multitude of rural communes. Elsewhere in the North and in Soviet Asia, several thousands of these organisms were established. partly on the initiative of the left social revolutionaries, and in large measures as a result of traditional collectivist impulses which stem from the Russian village, the mir. It matters little whether these communes were numerous or embraced large numbers of peasants. The point is that they were authentic popular organisms, the nuclei for a moral and social spirit that ranged far above the dehumanizing values of bourgeois society. The Bolsheviks frowned upon these organisms from the very beginning and eventually condemned them. To Lenin, the preferred, the more, quote, socialist, end quote, form of agricultural enterprise was represented by the state farm, an agricultural factory in which the state owned the land and farming equipment, appointing managers who hired peasants on a wage basis. One sees in these attitudes towards workers' control in agricultural communes the essentially bourgeois spirit and mentality that permeated the Bolshevik Party, a spirit and mentality that emanated not only from its theories, but also from its corporate mode of organization. In December 1918, Lenin launched an attack against the communes on the pretext that peasants were being, quote, forced, end quote, to enter them. Actually, little if any coercion was used to organize these communistic forms of self-management. As Robert G. Wesson, who studied the Soviet communes in detail, concludes, quote, those who went into communes must have done so largely of their own volition, end quote. The communes were not suppressed, but their growth was discouraged until Stalin merged the entire development into the forced collectivization drives of the late 20s and early 30s. It says that Robert G. Wesson he wrote a book in 1963 on Soviet communes. The communes were not suppressed, but their growth was discouraged until Stalin... I already read that. Yeah, that's from Robert G. Wesson's Soviet Communes. I don't know if there's a... doesn't seem like there's a... Sorry, I'm looking to see if there's any description of this. Okay, I'm not seeing any description. So, let's boogie. Apparently I missed a footnote. It says that Osinski quote is from On the Building of Socialism. Numbers 2, April 1918, quote in R.V. Daniels, The Conscience of the Revolution. I have the first 2 chapters of The Conscience of the Revolution up on the channel, but only the first 2 chapters. I didn't finish reading the book, but I plan on finishing reading it eventually, but I'll probably just put it up as like miscellaneous chapters because that's kind of like, I'll probably put them up as like each chapter is its own like standalone piece just because I feel like there's still value in getting portions of a book on the channel, even if in reading portions of books, even if you don't finish the entire thing. Especially when there's so much to read and so much diversity, there's something more democratic about reading a lot of different small pieces, right, in your mind, right? You get more of a conversation going by reading a lot of different people than by reading like necessarily like large tomes by like a single person. Not that large tomes aren't important and the detail that you get out of large tomes isn't important, but like there's a lot of things to read in the world. Anyway, just a little self-commentary to myself. By 1920, the Bolsheviks had isolated themselves from the Russian working class and peasantry, taken together the elimination of workers' control, the suppression of the Makhnovtsi, the restricted political atmosphere in the country, the inflated bureaucracy and the crushing material poverty inherited from the Civil War years generated a deep hostility toward Bolshevik rule. With the end of hostilities, a movement surged up from the depths of Russian society for a, quote, third revolution, end quote, not to restore the past, as the Bolsheviks claimed, but to realize the very goals of freedom, economic as well as political, that had rallied the masses around the Bolshevik program of 1917. For a defense of these uprisings, such as Kronstadt, as a third revolution. Check out the piece on my channel by Alexei Gusev, who is a Russian historian who had a I don't know what's going on with him now, but he was like organized a thing called the Victor Serge Library in Moscow, which I think is fascinating. But he defends this idea that it's a third revolution. Anyway, the new movement found its most conscious forms in the Petrograd proletariat and among the Kronstadt sailors. It also found expression in the growth of anti-centralist and anarcho-syndicalist tendencies among the Bolsheviks, reached a point where a block of oppositional groups oriented towards these issues gained 124 seats at a Moscow provincial conference, as against 154 for supporters of the Central Committee. On March 2nd, 1921, the, quote, Red Sailors, end quote, of Kronstadt rose in open rebellion, raising the banner of a, quote, third revolution of the toilers, end quote. The Kronstadt program centered around demands for free elections to the Soviets, freedom of speech and press for the anarchists and left socialist parties, free trade unions, and the liberation of all prisoners who belonged to socialist parties. The most shameless stories were fabricated by the Bolsheviks to account for this uprising, acknowledged in later years as brazen lies. The revolt was characterized as a, quote, White Guard plot, end quote, despite the fact that the great majority of the Communist Party members in Kronstadt joined the sailors precisely as communists. Precisely as communists. That's great. It's actually very true. In denouncing the party leaders as betrayers of the October Revolution, as Robert Vincent Daniels, who is the author of The Conscience of the Revolution, observes in his study of Bolshevik oppositional movements, quote, ordinary communists were indeed so unreliable, ... that the government did not depend upon them either to assault on Kronstadt itself or in keeping order in Petrograd, where Kronstadt's hopes for support chiefly rested. The main body of troops employed were Chekist and officer cadets from Red Army training schools. The final assault on Kronstadt was led by the top officialdom of the Communist Party. A large group of delegates to the 10th Party Congress was rushed from Moscow for this purpose, end quote. R.V. Daniels. So weak was the regime internally that the elite had to do its own dirty work. Even more significant than the Kronstadt revolt was the strike movement that developed among the Petrograd workers, a movement that sparked the uprising of the sailors. Leninist histories do not recount this critically important development. The first strikes broke out in the Trubachny factory on February 23rd, 1921. Also, for more detailed overview of Kronstadt, check out The Kronstadt Commune by Ida Met. Okay, sorry. The first strikes broke out in the Trubachny factory on February 23rd, 1921. Within a matter of days, the movement swept one factory after another until by February 28th, the famous Putilov works, the crucible of the revolution, went on strike. Come on. Not only were economic demands raised, the workers raised distinctly political demands, anticipating all the demands that were to be raised by the Kronstadt sailors a few days later. On February 24th, the Bolsheviks declared a, quote, state of siege, end quote, in Petrograd and arrested the strike leaders, suppressing the workers' demonstrations and with officer cadets. The fact is, the Bolsheviks did not merely suppress a, quote, sailors' mutiny, end quote, they crushed the working class itself. The fact is, the Bolsheviks did not merely suppress a, quote, sailors' mutiny, end quote. The Bolsheviks crushed the working class itself. It was at this point that Lenin demanded the banning of factions in the Russian Communist Party. Centralization of the party was now complete, and the way paved for Stalin. We have discussed these events in detail because they lead to a conclusion that the latest crop of Marxist-Leninists tend to avoid. The Bolshevik Party reached its maximum degree of centralization in Lenin's day, not to achieve a revolution or suppress a White Guard counter-revolution. Not to achieve a revolution or suppress a White Guard counter-revolution, but to effect a counter-revolution of its own against the very social forces it professed to represent. But to effect a counter-revolution of its own against the very social forces it professed to represent. Factions were prohibited in a monolithic party created not to prevent a, quote, capitalist restoration, end quote, but to contain a mass movement of workers for Soviet democracy and social freedom. The Lenin of 1921 stood opposed to the Lenin of 1917. Thereafter, Lenin simply floundered. This man who above all sought to anchor the problems of his party in social contradictions found himself literally playing an organizational, quote, numbers game, end quote, in a last-ditch attempt to arrest the very bureaucratization he himself had created. There is nothing more pathetic and tragic than Lenin's last years. Paralyzed by a simplistic body of Marxist formulas, he could think of no better countermeasures than organizational ones. He proposed the formation of the Workers' and Peasants' Inspection to correct bureaucratic deformations in the party and state. And this body falls under Stalin's control and becomes highly bureaucratic in its own right. Wikipedia says Rabkrin, the People's Commissariat of the Workers' and Peasants' Inspection, also known as Rabkrin, was a governmental establishment in the Soviet Union of ministerial-level People's Commissariat that was responsible for scrutinizing the state, local, and enterprise administrations. On February 7, 1920, the Central Executive Committee of the Soviet Union established the Rabkrin to succeed the People's Commissariat for State Control. The term, quote, Rabkrin, end quote, comes from the Russian title Narodny Commissariat Robasha Krestyanskoy Inspekcji, the People's Commissariat of the Workers' and Peasants' Inspectorate. Rabkrin was put in place to ensure the effectiveness of the newly created Soviet government, which had experienced bureaucratic turmoil beginning with the Russian Revolution and continued into the Civil War. The People's Commissariat for State Control was a key institute for creating the Soviet Union, but its mismanagement of bureaucratic control led Vladimir Lenin to disband the council and to replace it with a more manageable division of government authority. The former commissar of the People's Commissariat for State Control, Joseph Stalin, was placed in charge of the newly formed agency, Rabkrin, which was a signal in the beginning of Soviet administration. Since it was a creation of the Soviet Union, it had no connection to the Russian Empire. So it sounds like Bookchin is not talking out of his ass here about Stalin taking control over it. Back to the text. Lenin then suggests that the size of the Workers' and Peasants' Inspection be reduced and that it merged with the Control Commission. Wikipedia says the Wikipedia on Central Control Commission of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was a supreme disciplinary body since 1934 within the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Its members were elected at plenary sessions of the Central Committee. It actually looks like what might be being referred to as the People's Control Committee, so the People's Control Commission, which according to Wikipedia, was a semi-civic, semi-governmental organization. It says Wikipedia says clarification needed. organization in the Soviet Union with the purpose of putting under scrutiny the activities of government, local administrations, and enterprises. It traces its roots back to Rabkin, the Workers' and Peasants' Inspectorate established in 1920. When Joseph Stalin rose to power, he merged Rabkin with the CPSU Control Committee, only to unmerge them in the 1930s. It seems like what was suggested earlier is that these things kind of came together before then. Nikita Khrushchev, seeking to emulate the Bolsheviks, but as part of his de-Stalinization efforts, merged them again and created the Committee of Party State Control of the Central Committee of the CPSU and of the Council of Ministers of the USSR, putting the ambitious Alexander Shelepin in charge. In 1965, Leonid Brezhnev and the collective leadership around him separated them once more to restrain Shelepin's ambitions. The 1979 USSR law on the People's Control established committees of People's Control in each Soviet republic under the supervision of the Central Committee of People's Control. These committees had the authority to audit government and economic administration records. Officials found guilty of illegalities could be publicly reprimanded, fined for damages, or referred to the procurator for prosecution. In the late 1980s, the Committees of People's Control were an invaluable instrument in Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev's efforts at reform and perestroika. The Committees of People's Control extended throughout the Soviet Union. In 1989, of the more than 10 million citizens who served in these organs, 95% were volunteers. General meetings of work collectives at every enterprise and office elected the committees for tenures of 2.5 years. The chairman of the Committee of People's Control and a professional staff served for 5 years. The chairman of the USSR Council of Ministers. The chairman sat on the USSR Council of Ministers. Back to the text. Lenin advocates enlarging the Central Committee. Thus it rolls along, this body to be enlarged, that one to be merged with another, still a third to be modified or abolished. The strange ballet of organizational forms continues up to his very death, as though the problem would be resolved by organizational means. As Moshe Lewin, an obvious admirer of Lenin, admits, the Bolshevik leader, quote, approached the problems of government more like a chief executive of a strictly, quote, elitist, end quote, turn of mind. He did not apply methods of social analysis to the government and was content to consider it purely in terms of organizational methods, end quote. That's from Moshe Lewin's Lenin's Last Struggle. Moshe Lewin, there's like a kind of generation of intergenerational history of Soviet scholarship. Moshe Lewin was the thesis advisor of Stephen A. Smith, and Stephen A. Smith was the advisor of Simon Pirani. From Amazon, the description of Lenin's Last Struggle, which this quote comes from, says, one of the great political strategists of his era, V.I. Lenin continues to attract historical interest, yet his complex personality eludes full understanding. This new edition of Moshe Lewin's classical political biography, including an afterword by the author, suggests new approaches for studying the Marxist visionary and founder of the Soviet state. Lenin's Last Struggle offers invaluable insights into the rise of the Bolshevik Party in the Soviet Union, a saga complicated by complex strategic battles among the leaders of Lenin's generation, leaders whose names are universally known but whose personalities and motivations are even now not sufficiently understood. Moshe Lewin was a collective farm worker in the USSR and a soldier in the Soviet Army. Moshe Lewin later became director of studies at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris, a fellow of the Kennan Institute, a senior fellow of Columbia University's Russian Institute, and is now emeritus professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm pretty sure Moshe Lewin's dead. This book was republished in 2005, so... And Wikipedia just says Moshe Lewin he died in 2010. Lived from 1921 to 2010. Was a scholar of Russian and Soviet history. Is a major figure in the School of Soviet Studies that emerged in the 1960s. Okay, back to the text. End footnote. If it is true that in the bourgeois revolutions, the, quote, phrase went beyond the content, end quote, in the Bolshevik Revolution, the forms replaced the content. The Soviets replaced the workers and their factory committees. The party replaced the Soviets, the Central Committee replaced the party, and the Political Bureau replaced the Central Committee. In short, means replaced ends. The incredible substitution of form for content is one of the most characteristic traits of Marxism-Leninism. In France, during the May-June events, all the Bolshevik organizations were prepared to destroy the Sorbonne Student Assembly in order to increase their influence and membership. Their principal concern was not the revolution or the authentic social forms created by the students, but the growth of their own parties. Only one force could have arrested the growth of bureaucracy in Russia, a social force. Had the Russian proletariat and peasantry succeeded in increasing the domain of self-management through the development of viable factory committees, rural communes, and free Soviets, the history of the country might have taken a dramatically different turn. There can be no question that the failure of socialist revolutions in Europe after the First World War led to the isolation of the revolution in Russia. The material poverty of Russia, coupled with the pressure of the surrounding capitalist world, clearly militated against the development of a socialist or a consistently libertarian society. But by no means was it ordained that Russia had to develop along state capitalist lines, contrary to Lenin and Trotsky's initial expectations. The revolution was defeated by internal forces, not by invasion of armies from abroad. Had the movement from below restored the initial achievements of the revolution in 1917, a multifaceted social structure might have developed based on workers' control of industry, on a freely developing peasant economy and agriculture, and on a living interplay of ideas, programs, and political movements. At the very least, Russia would not have been imprisoned in totalitarian chains, and Stalinism would not have poisoned the world revolutionary movement, paving the way for fascism and the Second World War. The development of the Bolshevik Party, however, precluded this development. Lenin or Trotsky's, quote, good intentions, end quote, notwithstanding, by destroying the power of the factory committees and industry and by crushing the Makhnovtsi, the Petrograd workers and the Kronstadt sailors, the Bolsheviks virtually guaranteed the triumph of the Russian bureaucracy over Russian society. The centralized party, a completely bourgeois institution, became the refuge of counter-revolution in its most sinister form. This was covert counter-revolution which draped itself in the red flag and the terminology of Marx. Ultimately, what the Bolsheviks suppressed in 1921 was not a, quote, ideology or a, quote, white guard conspiracy, end quote, but an elemental struggle of the Russian people to free themselves of their shackles and take control of their own destiny. Footnote. In interpreting this elemental movement of the Russian workers and peasants as a series of, quote, white guard conspiracies, quote, acts of kulak resistance, and, quote, plots of international capital, the Bolsheviks reached an incredible theoretical low and deceived no one but themselves. A spiritual erosion developed within the party that paved the way for the politics of the secret police, for character assassination, and finally for the Moscow trials and the annihilation of the old Bolshevik cadre. One sees the return of this odious mentality in PL articles, Progressive Labor Party, articles like, quote, Marcuse, Cop Out, or Cop, the theme of which is to establish Marcuse as an agent of the CIA. The article has a caption under a photograph of demonstrating Parisians which reads, quote, Marcuse got to Paris too late to stop the May action, end quote. Opponents of the Progressive Labor Party invariably described by this rag as, quote, red baiters and as, quote, anti-worker. If the American left does not repudiate this police approach and character assassination, it will bitterly pay in the years to come. End footnote. For Russia, this meant the nightmare of Stalinist dictatorship. For the generation of the 30s, it meant the horror of fascism and the treachery of communist parties in Europe and the United States. The two traditions. It would be incredibly naive to suppose that Leninism was the product of a single man. The disease lies much deeper, not only in the limitations of Marxian theory, but in the limitations of the social era that produced Marxism. If this is not clearly understood, we will remain as blind to the dialectic of events today as Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky were in their own day. For us, this blindness will be all the more reprehensible because behind us lies a wealth of experience that these men lacked in developing their theories. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were centralists, not only politically but socially and economically. They never denied this fact, and their writings are studied with economicums to political, organizational, and economic centralization. As early as March 1850, in the famous Address of the Central Council of the Communist League, they called upon the workers to strive not only for the, quote, single and indivisible German Republic, but also strive in it for the most decisive centralization of power in the hands of the state authority, end quote. Lest the demand be taken lightly, it is repeated continually in the same paragraph, which concludes, quote, as in France in 1793, so today in Germany, the carrying through of strictest centralization is the task of the really revolutionary party, end quote. The same theme reappears continually in later years. With the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War, for example, Marx writes to Engels, quote, the French need a thrashing. If the Prussians win, the centralization of state power will be useful for the centralization of the German working class, end quote. Marx and Engels, however, were not centralists because they believed in the virtues of centralism per se. Quite the contrary, both Marxism and anarchism have always agreed that a liberated communist society entails sweeping decentralization, the dissolution of bureaucracy, the abolition of the state, and the breakup of large cities. Quote, abolition of the antithesis between town and country is not merely possible, end quote, notes Engels in Anti-Düring. Quote, the abolition of the antithesis between town and country has become a direct necessity. The present poisoning of the air, water, and land can be put to an end only by the fusion of town and country, end quote. To Engels, this involves a, quote, uniform distribution of the population over the whole country, end quote. In short, the physical decentralization of the cities. The origins of Marxian centralism are in problems arising from the formation of the national state. Until well into the latter half of the 19th century, Germany and Italy were divided into a multitude of independent duchies, principalities, and kingdoms. The consolidation of these geographic units into unified nations, Marx and Engels believed, was a sine qua non for the development of modern industry and capitalism. Their praise of centralism was engendered not by any centralistic mystique, but by the events of the period in which they lived. The development of technology, trade, a unified working class, and the national state. Their concern on this score, in short, is with the emergence of capitalism, with the task of the bourgeois revolution in an era of unavoidable material scarcity. Marx's approach to a, quote, proletarian revolution, end quote, on the one hand is markedly different. He enthusiastically praises the Paris Commune as a, quote, model of all of the industrial centers of France, end quote. He writes, quote, once established in Paris and the secondary centers, the old centralized government would in the provinces too have to give way to the self-government of the producers. The self-government of the producers, end quote. The unity of the nations, to be sure, would not disappear, and a central government would exist during the transition to communism, but its functions would be limited. Our object is not to bandy about quotations from Marx and Engels, but to emphasize how key tenets of Marxism, which are accepted so uncritically today, were in fact the product of an era that has long been transcended by the development of capitalism in the United States and Western Europe. In his day, Marx was occupied not only with the problems of the, quote, proletarian revolution, end quote, but also with the problems of bourgeois revolution, particularly in Germany, Spain, Italy, and Eastern Europe. Marx dealt with the problems of transition from capitalism to socialism in capitalist countries which had not advanced much beyond the coal-steel technology of the Industrial Revolution, with the problem of the transition from feudalism to capitalism in countries which had scarcely advanced much beyond handicrafts and the guild system. To state these concerns broadly, Marx was occupied above all with the preconditions of freedom, technological development, national unification, material abundance, rather than with the conditions of freedom, decentralization, the formation of communities, the human scale, direct democracy. Marx's theories were still anchored in the realm of survival, not the realm of life. Once this is grasped, it is possible to place Marx's theoretical legacy in meaningful perspective, to separate its rich contributions from its historically limited, indeed paralyzing shackles on our own time. The Marxian dialectic, the many seminal insights provided by historical materialism, the superb critique of the commodity relationship, many elements of the economic theories, the theory of alienation, and above all the notion that freedom has material preconditions, these are lasting contributions to revolutionary thought. Where am I? By the same token, Marx's emphasis on the industrial proletariat as the, quote, agent, end quote, of revolutionary change, his, quote, class analysis, end quote, and explain the transition from a class to a classless society, his concept of the proletarian dictatorship, his emphasis on centralism, his theory of capitalist development, which tends to jumble state capitalism with socialism, his advocacy of political action through electoral parties. These and many related concepts are false in the context of our time and were misleading, as we shall see, even in his own day. They emerge from the limitations of his vision, more properly from the limitations of his time. They make sense only if one remembers that Marx regarded capitalism as historically progressive, as an indispensable stage to the development of socialism, and they have practical applicability only to a time when Germany in particular was confronted by bourgeois democratic tasks and national unification. We are not trying to say that Marx was correct in holding this approach, merely that the approach makes sense when viewed in its time and place. Just as the Russian Revolution included a subterranean movement of the, quote, masses, end quote, which conflicted with Bolshevism, so there's a subterranean movement in history which conflicts with all systems of authority. The movement has entered into our time under the name of, quote, anarchism, end quote, although it has never been encompassed by a single ideology or body of sacred texts. Anarchism is a libidinal movement of humanity against coercion in any form, reaching back in time to the very emergence of property in society, class rule, and the state. From this period onward, the oppressed have resisted all forms that seek to imprison the spontaneous development of social order. Anarchism has surged to the foreground of the social arena in periods of major transition, from one historical era to another. The decline of the ancient and feudal world witnessed the upsurge of mass movements, in some cases wildly Dionysian in character, that demanded an end to all systems of authority, privilege, and coercion. The anarchic movements of the past failed largely because material scarcity, a function of the low level of technology, vitiated an organic harmonization of human interest. Any society that could promise little more materially than equality of poverty invariably engendered deep-seated tendencies to restore a new system of privilege. In the absence of technology that could appreciably reduce the working day, the need to work vitiated social institutions based on self-management. The Girondins of the French Revolution surely recognized that they could use the working day against revolutionary Paris. To exclude radical elements from the sections, they tried to enact legislation which would end all assembly meetings before 10 p.m. The hour when Parisian workers returned from their jobs. Indeed, it was not only the manipulative techniques and the treachery of the, quote, vanguard, end quote, organizations that brought the anarchic phases of past revolutions to an end. It was also the material limits of past eras. The, quote, masses, end quote, were always compelled to return to a lifetime of toil, and rarely were they free to establish organs of self-management that could last beyond the revolution. Anarchists such as Bookchin and Kropotkin, however, were by no means wrong in criticizing Marx for his emphasis on centralism and his elitist notions of organization. Was centralism absolutely necessary for technological advance in the past? Was the nation-state indispensable to the expansion of commerce? Did the workers' movement benefit by the emergence of highly centralized economic enterprises and the, quote, indivisible, end quote, state? We tend to accept these tenets of Marxism too uncritically, largely because capitalism developed within a centralized political arena. The anarchists of the last century warned that Marx's centralistic approach, insofar as it affected the events of the time, would so strengthen the bourgeoisie and the state apparatus that the overthrow of capitalism would be extremely difficult. The Revolutionary Party, by duplicating these centralistic hierarchical features, would reproduce hierarchy and centralism in the post-revolutionary society. Bookchin and Kropotkin and Malatesta were not so naive as to believe that anarchism could be established overnight. In imputing this notion to Bakunin, Marx and Engels willfully distorted the Russian anarchist views. Nor did the anarchists of the last century believe that the abolition of the state involved, quote, laying down arms, end quote, immediately after the revolution. To use Marx's obscurantist choice of terms, thoughtlessly repeated by Lenin in State and Revolution. Indeed, much that passes for, quote, Marxism, end quote, in State and Revolution is pure anarchism. For example, the substitution of revolutionary militias for professional armed bodies, and the substitution of organs of self-management for parliamentary bodies. What is authentically Marxist in Lenin's pamphlet is the demand for, quote, strict centralism, end quote, the acceptance of a, quote, new, end quote, bureaucracy, and the identification of the Soviets with a state. The anarchists of the last century were deeply preoccupied with the question of achieving industrialization without crushing the revolutionary spirit of the, quote, masses, end quote, and rearing new obstacles to emancipation. They feared that centralization would reinforce the ability of the bourgeoisie to resist the revolution and to instill in the workers a sense of obedience. They tried to rescue all these pre-capitalist communal forms, such as the Russian mir and the Russian pueblo, which might provide a springboard to a free society, not only to a structural sense, but also a spiritual one. Hence, they emphasized the need for decentralization even under capitalism. To contrast to the Marxian parties, their organizations gave considerable attention to what they called, quote, integral education, end quote, the development of the whole man, to counteract the debasing and banalizing influence of bourgeois society. The anarchists tried to live by the values of the future to the extent that this was possible under capitalism. The anarchists believed in direct action to foster the initiative of the, quote, masses, end quote, to preserve the spirit of revolt, to encourage spontaneity. They tried to develop organizations based on mutual aid and brotherhood in which control would be exercised from below upward, not downward from above. We must pause here to examine the nature of anarchist organizational forms in some detail, if only because the subject has been obscured by an appalling amount of rubbish. Anarchists, or at least anarcho-communists, accept the need for organization. It should be absurd to have to repeat this point as to argue over whether Marx accepted the need for social revolution. Footnote. The term, quote, anarchist, end quote, is a generic word like the term, quote, socialist, end quote, and there are probably as many different kinds of anarchists as there are socialists. In both cases, the spectrum from individuals whose views derive from an extension of liberalism, the, quote, individualist anarchists, end quote, the social democrats, to revolutionary communists, the anarcho-communists, the revolutionary Marxists, Leninists, and Trotskyists. End footnote. It should be absurd to have repeated this point to argue over whether Marx accepted the need for social revolution. The real question at issue here is not organization versus non-organization, but rather what kind of organization the anarcho-communists try to establish. What the different kinds of anarcho-communist organization have in common is organic developments from below, not bodies engineered into existence from above. Anarcho-communist organizations are social movements combining a creative revolutionary lifestyle with a creative revolutionary theory, not political parties whose mode of life is indistinguishable from the surrounding bourgeois environment and whose ideology is reduced to rigid, quote, tried and tested programs, end quote. As much as is humanly possible, they try to reflect the liberated society they seek to achieve, not slavishly duplicate the prevailing system of hierarchy, class, and authority. They are built around intimate groups of brothers and sisters, affinity groups whose ability to act in common is based on initiative, on convictions freely arrived at, and on a deep personal involvement, not around a bureaucratic apparatus fleshed out by a docile membership and manipulated from above by a handful of all-knowing leaders. The anarcho-communists do not deny the need for coordination between groups, for discipline, for meticulous planning, and for unity of action. They believe that coordination, discipline, planning, and unity in action must be achieved voluntarily, by means of self-discipline nourished by conviction and understanding, not by coercion and a mindless, unquestioning obedience to orders from above. They seek to achieve effectiveness imputed to centralism by means of voluntarism and insight, not by establishing a hierarchical centralized structure. Depending upon needs or circumstances, affinity groups can achieve this effectiveness through assemblies, action committees, and local, regional, and national conferences. But they vigorously oppose the establishment of an organizational structure that becomes an end in itself, of communities that linger on after their practical tasks that have been completed, of a, quote, leadership, end quote, that reduces the, quote, revolutionary, end quote, to a mindless robot. These conclusions are not the result of flighty, quote, individualist, end quote, impulses. Quite to the contrary, they emerge from an exacting study of past revolutions, of the impact centralizing parties have had on the revolutionary process, and of the nature of social change in an era of potential material abundance. Anarcho-communists seek to preserve and extend the anarchic phase that opens all the great social revolutions. Even more than Marxist, anarcho-communists recognize that revolutions are produced by deep historical processes. No central committee, quote, makes, end quote, a social revolution. At best, it can stage a coup d'etat, replacing one hierarchy by another, or worse, arrest a revolutionary process if it exercises any widespread influence. A central committee is an organ for acquiring power, for recreating power, for gathering to itself what the, quote, masses, end quote, have achieved by their own revolutionary efforts. One must be blind to all that has happened over the past 2 centuries to recognize these, not to recognize these essential facts. In the past, Marxists could make an intelligible, although invalid, claim for the need for a centralized party, because the anarchic phase of the revolution was nullified by material scarcity. Economically, the, quote, masses, end quote, were always compelled to return to daily life of toil. The revolution passed at 10 o'clock, quite aside from the reactionary the revolution closed at 10 o'clock, quite aside from the reactionary intentions of the Girondins of 1793. It was arrested by the low level of technology. Today, even this excuse has been removed by the development of post-scarcity technology, notably in the US and Western Europe. A point has now been reached where the, quote, masses, end quote, can begin almost overnight to expand drastically the, quote, realm of freedom, end quote, in the Marxian sense, to acquire the leisure time needed to achieve the highest degree of self-management. Just want to read real quick what the politics of the Girondins. It says their ideology, on Wikipedia it says their ideology was abolitionism, republicanism, classical liberalism, economic liberalism. The Girondins, or Girondists, were a political group during the French Revolution. From 1791 to 1793, the Girondins were active in the Legislative Assembly and the National Convention. Together with the Montagnards, they initially were part of the Jacobin movement. They campaigned for the end of the monarchy, but then resisted the spiraling momentum of the revolution, which caused a conflict with the more radical Montagnards. They dominated the movement until their fall in the insurrection of the 31st of May to the 2nd of June 1793, which resulted in the domination of the Montagnard and the purge and eventual mass execution of the Girondins. This event is considered to mark the beginning of the Reign of Terror. The Girondins were a group of loosely affiliated individuals rather than an organized political party, and the name was at first informally applied because the most prominent exponents of their point of view were deputies to the Legislative Assembly from the Department of Gironde in southwest France. Girondin leader Jacques-Pierre Brissot proposed an ambitious military plan to spread the revolution internationally. Therefore, the Girondins were the war party in 1792 to 1793. Other prominent Girondins included Jean-Marie Roland and his Roland and his wife Madame Roland. They also had an ally in the English-born American activist Thomas Paine. Brissot and Madame Roland were executed, and Jean Roland, who had gone into hiding, committed suicide when he learned about the execution. Paine was imprisoned, but he narrowly escaped execution. The famous painting The Death of Marat depicts the fiery radical journalist and denouncer of the Girondins, Jean-Paul Marat. Jean-Paul Marat, after being stabbed to death in his bathtub by Charlotte Corday, a Girondin sympathizer. Corday did not attempt to flee and was arrested and executed. Back to the text. What the May June events in France demonstrated was not the need for a Bolshevik-type party, but the need for greater consciousness among the, quote, masses, end quote. Paris demonstrated that an organization is needed to propagate ideas systematically, and not ideas alone, but ideas which promote the concept of self-management. What the French, quote, masses, end quote, lacked was not a central committee or a Lenin to, quote, organize or, quote, command them, but the conviction that they could have operated the factories instead of merely occupying the factories. It is noteworthy that not a single Bolshevik-type party in France raised the demand of self-management. Not a single Bolshevik-type party in France raised the demand of self-management. The demand was raised only by the anarchists and the situationists. There is a need for a revolutionary organization, but its function must always be kept clearly in mind. Its first task is propaganda, to, quote, patiently explain, end quote, as Lenin put it. In a revolutionary situation, the revolutionary organization presents the most advanced demands. It is prepared at every turn of events to formulate, in the most concrete fashion, the immediate task that should be performed to advance the revolutionary process. It provides the boldest elements in action in the decision-making organs of the revolution. In what way, then, do anarchist communist groups differ from the Bolshevik type of party? Certainly not on such issues as the need for organization, planning, coordination, propaganda in all its forms, or the need for a social program. Fundamentally, the anarcho-communists differ from the Bolshevik type of party in their belief that genuine revolutionaries must function within the framework of the forms created by the revolution. Must function within the framework of the forms created by the revolution, not within the forms created by the party. What this means is that their commitment is to the revolutionary organs of self-management, not to the revolutionary, quote, organizations, end quote, to the social forms, not the political forms. Anarcho-communists seek to persuade the factory committees, assemblies, or Soviets to make themselves into genuine organs of popular self-management, not to dominate them, manipulate them, or hitch them to an all-knowing political party. Anarcho-communists do not seek to rear a state structure over these popular revolutionary organs, but on the contrary to dissolve all the organizational forms developed in the pre-revolutionary period, including their own, into these genuine revolutionary organs. These differences are decisive, despite their rhetoric and slogans. These differences are decisive, despite their rhetoric and slogans. The Russian Bolsheviks never believed in the Soviets. They regarded them as instruments of the Bolshevik Party, an attitude which the French Trotsky has faithfully duplicated in their relations with the Sorbonne Students' Assembly, the French Maoists with the French labor unions, and the old left groups with SDS. By 1921, the Soviets were virtually dead, and all the decisions were made by the Bolshevik Central Committee and the Political Bureau. Not only do anarcho-communists seek to prevent Marxist parties from repeating this, they also wish to prevent their own organization from playing a similar role. Accordingly, they try to prevent bureaucracy, hierarchy, and elites from emerging in their midst. No less important, they attempt to remake themselves, to root out from their own personalities those authoritarian traits and elitist propensities that are assimilated in hierarchical society almost from birth. The concern of the anarchist movement with lifestyle is not merely a preoccupation with its own integrity, but the integrity of the revolution itself. Footnote. It is this goal, we may add, that motivates anarchist Dadaism, the anarchist flypoint that produces the creases of consternation on the wooden faces of the progressive Labor Party types. The anarchist flip-out attempts to shatter the internal values inherited from hierarchical society, to explode the rigidities instilled by this bourgeois socialization process. In short, it is an attempt to break down the superego that exercises such a paralyzing effect upon spontaneity, imagination, and sensibility, and to restore a sense of desire, possibility, and the marvelous, of revolution as a liberating, joyous festival. End footnote. In the midst of all the confusing ideological cross-currents of our time, one question must always remain in the foreground. What the hell are we trying to make a revolution for? Are we trying to make a revolution to recreate hierarchy, dangling a shadowy dream of future freedom before the eyes of humanity? Is it to promote further technological advance, to create an even greater abundance of goods than exists today? Is it to, quote, get even, end quote, with the bourgeoisie? Is it to bring the Progressive Labor Party to power, or the Communist Party, or the Socialist Workers' Party. Progressive Labor Party being the Maoist Party, or the Communist Party being the Communist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party being the American Trotskyist Party at the time, the dominant one. Is it to emancipate abstractions such as the, quote, proletariat, quote, the people, quote, history, quote, society? Or is it finally to dissolve hierarchy, class rule, and coercion, to make it possible for each individual to gain control of his everyday life? To make it possible for each individual to gain control over his everyday life? Is it to make each moment as marvelous as it could be, and the lifespan of each individual an utterly fulfilling experience? If the true purpose of revolution is to bring the Neanderthal men of the Progressive Labor Party to power, it is not worth making. We need hardly argue the inane questions of whether individual development can be severed from social and communal development. Obviously, the two go together. The basis for a whole human being is a rounded society. The basis for a free human being is a free society. These issues aside, we are still faced with the question that Marx raised in 1850. When will we begin to take our poetry from the future instead of the past? The dead must be permitted to bury the dead. Marxism is dead because it was rooted in an era of material scarcity, limited in its possibilities by material want. The most important social message of Marxism is that freedom has material preconditions. We must survive in order to live. With the development of a technology that could not be conceived by the wildest science fiction of Marx's day, the possibility of a post-scarcity society now lies before us. All the institutions of property society, class rule, hierarchy, the patriarchal family, bureaucracy, the state, the state, have been exhausted. Today, decentralization is not only desirable as a means of restoring the human scale, it is necessary to create a viable ecology, to preserve life on this planet from the destructive pollutants and soil erosion, to preserve a breathable atmosphere and the balance of nature. The promotion of spontaneity is necessary if the social revolution is to place each individual in control of his everyday life. The old forms of struggle do not totally disappear with the decomposition of class society, but they are being transcended by the issues of a classless society. There can be no social revolution without winning the workers, hence they must have our active solidarity in every struggle they wage against exploitation. We fight against social crimes wherever they appear, and industrial exploitation is a profound social crime. But so are racism, the denial of the right to self-determination, imperialism and poverty, profound social crimes. And for that matter, so are pollution, rampant urbanization, the malignant socialization of the young, and sexual repression. As for the problem of winning the working class to the revolution, we must bear in mind that a precondition for the existence of the bourgeoisie is the development of the proletariat. Capitalism as a social system presupposes the existence of both classes and is perpetuated by the development of both classes. We begin to undermine the premises of class rule to the degree that we foster the declassifying of the non-bourgeois classes, at least institutionally, psychologically, and culturally. For the first time in history, the anarchic phase that opened all the great revolutions of the past can be preserved as a permanent condition by the advanced technology of our time. The anarchic institutions of that phase, the assemblies, the factory committees, the action committees, can be stabilized as the elements of a liberated society, as the elements of a new system of self-management. Will we build a movement that can defend them? Can we create an organization of affinity groups that is capable of dissolving into these revolutionary institutions? Or will we build a hierarchical, centralized, bureaucratic party that will try to dominate them, supplant them, and finally destroy them? Listen, Marxist, the organization we try to build is the kind of society our revolution will create. Either we shall shed the past in ourselves as in our groups, or there will simply be no future to win. That's the end of the essay. It was written in New York, May 1969. There's a brief appendix here. It's titled A Note on Affinity Groups. The term, quote, affinity group, end quote, is the English translation of the Spanish Grupo de Afinidad,
which was the name of an organizational form devised in pre-Franco days as the basis for the redoubtable Federación Anarquista Ibérica, the Iberian Anarchist Federation. The FAI consisted of the most idealistic militants of the CNT, the immense anarcho-syndicalist labor union, a slavish imitation of the FAI's forms of organization, and the methods would be neither possible nor desirable. The Spanish anarchists of the 30s were faced with entirely different social problems from those which confront American anarchists today. The affinity group form, however, has features that apply to any social situation and that have often been intuitively adopted by American radicals who call the resulting organizations, quote, collectives, quote, communes, or, quote, families. The affinity group could easily be regarded as a new type of extended family, in which kinship ties are replaced by deeply emphatic human relationships nourished by common revolutionary ideas and practice. Long before the word, quote, tribe gained popularity in the American counterculture, the Spanish anarchists called their congresses asambleas de las tribus, assemblies of the tribes. Each affinity group is deliberately kept small to allow for the greatest degree of intimacy between those who compose it. Autonomous, communal, and directly democratic, the group combines revolutionary theory with revolutionary lifestyle and its everyday behavior. It creates a free space in which revolutionaries can remake themselves individually and also as social beings. Affinity groups are intended to function as catalysts within the popular movement, not as, quote, vanguards, end quote. They provide initiative and consciousness, not a, quote, general staff, end quote, and a source of, quote, command, end quote. The groups proliferate on a molecular level and they have their own, quote, Brownian movement, end quote. Whether they link together or separate, is determined by living situations, not by bureaucratic fiat from a distant center. Under conditions of political repression, affinity groups are highly resistant to police infiltration. Owing to the intimacy of the relationships between participants, the groups are often difficult to penetrate, and even if penetration occurs, there is no central apparatus to provide the infiltrator with an overview of the movement as a whole. Even under such demanding conditions, affinity groups can still retain contact with each other through their periodicals and literature. During periods of heightened activity, on the other hand, nothing prevents affinity groups from working together closely on any scale required by a living situation. They can easily federate by means of local, regional, or national assemblies to formulate common policies, and they can create temporary action committees like those of the French students and workers in 1968 to coordinate specific tasks. Affinity groups, however, are always rooted in the popular movement. Their loyalties belong to the social forms created by the revolutionary people, not to an impersonal bureaucracy. As a result of their autonomy and localism, the groups can retain a sensitive appreciation of new possibilities. Intensely experimental and variegated in lifestyles, they act as a stimulus on each other as well as on the popular movement. Each group tries to acquire the resources needed to function largely on its own. Each group seeks a rounded body of knowledge and experience in order to overcome the social and psychological limitations imposed by bourgeois society on individual development. Each group as a nucleus of consciousness and experience tries to advance the spontaneous revolutionary movement of the people to a point where the group can finally disappear into the organic social forms created by the revolution. Further reading, a discussion on, quote, listen, Marxist. Thanks for listening.